June 19th, 1944, 3:15 in the morning. The communications room aboard HMS Victorious rocks gently in the Pacific swells, its steel walls humming with the electronic symphony of modern naval warfare. Radar screens paint green arcs across darkness, tracking the movement of ships, aircraft, and weather systems across hundreds of square miles of ocean that looks empty but seethes with lethal purpose. Sub-Lieutenant David Morrison hunches over a plotting table, his eyes burning from 18 hours of continuous duty. The numbers on his calculation sheet blur together in the dim red light that preserves night vision, while allowing him to read coordinates, plot positions, and make the mathematical determinations that will guide Allied naval forces through the most complex battle in Pacific naval history. Morrison holds a pencil that weighs almost nothing but carries the responsibility of directing the movement of entire fleets. The coordinates he's calculating will be transmitted to American task forces, British carrier groups, and Australian cruiser squadrons. Ships will change course based on his mathematics. Aircraft will launch toward targets he identifies. Men will live or die based on numbers he plots on charts that reduce the vast Pacific Ocean to a grid of intersecting lines. The Japanese fleet he's tracking represents the largest concentration of naval power that Emperor Hirohito's forces have assembled since the attack on Pearl Harbor. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa commands 9 aircraft carriers, 5 battleships, 13 cruisers, and 28 destroyers, nearly 300,000 tons of warships, carrying enough firepower to obliterate any Allied force that crosses their path. Morrison's job is to tell Allied commanders where this armada is heading, when it will arrive, and how Allied forces can position themselves to intercept it before it can complete its mission. Operation Ago, the Japanese plan to destroy American carrier forces in the Philippine Sea, depends on achieving tactical surprise. Morrison's calculations are designed to deny them that surprise, but Morrison is exhausted. His hands shake slightly as he plots bearings on the chart. His eyes water as he peers at radar returns that could be ships, islands, weather formations, or electronic ghosts created by atmospheric interference. He's been tracking enemy movements for 3 consecutive nights, sustained by coffee that tastes like motor oil and adrenaline that comes from knowing that his mistakes could cost thousands of lives. Morrison makes a mistake. Not a large mistake, not an obvious error that would be caught by standard checking procedures. He transposes 2 digits in a coordinate calculation, placing a decimal point in the wrong position, shifting the reported location of the Japanese fleet by 47 nautical miles northwest of their actual position. 47 miles. In the vast scale of Pacific naval operations, a small error. In the context of what happens next, the difference between massacre and salvation. Morrison's miscalculation travels through the Allied communication network like electricity through copper wire. Radio operators encode it, transmit it, relay it to command centers where staff officers plot it on master charts that show the disposition of Allied and enemy forces across a battle area larger than most European countries. The false coordinates reach Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa aboard his flagship Taiho, intercepted by Japanese intelligence services that have been monitoring Allied communications for weeks. Ozawa studies the decoded message and sees opportunity. The Americans think his fleet is 47 miles northwest of its actual position. He can use this misinformation to achieve tactical surprise, approaching Allied forces from an unexpected direction while they maneuver to intercept a phantom fleet that exists only in Morrison's erroneous calculations. Ozawa orders his fleet to maintain course toward the coordinates where Allied intelligence believes his ships are located. Not the coordinates where his ships actually are, but the coordinates where Morrison's mistake has placed them on Allied charts. Ozawa will use the British navigation error to mask his true position until he can launch the decisive attack that will destroy American naval power in the Pacific. Except Morrison's mistake doesn't just change where the Japanese think the Allies think they are. Morrison's mistake changes where the Japanese actually go. By following a course designed to maintain the illusion created by false coordinates, Ozawa steers his fleet directly into a weather system that no meteorologist predicted, no reconnaissance aircraft spotted, and no intelligence service knew existed. Morrison's navigation error guides the most powerful naval force in Japanese history into a typhoon that will scatter their formation, delay their attack, and save the lives of 8,000 civilian refugees who were sailing directly through the path of the original Japanese battle plan. Morrison never learns about the storm. He discovers his coordinate error 6 hours later, during a routine verification check, and reports the correction through proper channels. Standard procedure for mathematical mistakes that happen when exhausted men work with complex data under impossible pressure. He assumes his error caused minor confusion, perhaps some wasted fuel, as ships adjusted their positions to account for corrected coordinates. He never knows that his mistake redirected the Japanese fleet into weather that would transform Operation Ago from a potential Allied disaster into an unexpected reprieve that saved thousands of lives. In naval warfare, position is everything. Ships that know where they are can navigate efficiently, coordinate with friendly forces, and attack enemy positions with precision. Ships that are lost become vulnerable, isolated, incapable of mutual support or effective offensive action. The side with better navigation usually wins, but sometimes the wrong position becomes salvation. Sometimes being lost saves you from being found by people who want to kill you. Sometimes the navigation error that should cause disaster instead prevents catastrophe. The Battle of the Philippine Sea had been building for weeks when Morrison made his crucial mistake. American forces under Admiral Raymond Spruance were protecting the invasion of Saipan, establishing a foothold in the Mariana Islands that would bring Allied bombers within range of the Japanese mainland. Japanese forces under Admiral Ozawa were attempting to destroy the American fleet before it could consolidate its position, using the concentrated power of the mobile fleet to achieve decisive victory in a single engagement. Both sides understood that this battle would determine the future course of the Pacific War. If the Japanese succeeded in destroying American carrier forces, they could halt Allied advancement and potentially force a negotiated settlement that would preserve their empire. If the Americans successfully defended their positions, they would have established the bases necessary for the eventual bombing campaign that would bring the war to Japan itself. Morrison's role in this strategic confrontation was technical rather than tactical. He was a navigation specialist, responsible for tracking enemy movements and calculating intercept courses for Allied forces. His work required mathematical precision, attention to detail, and the ability to translate radar observations into accurate position reports that commanders could use for operational planning. Under normal circumstances, Morrison's calculations were checked and verified by multiple operators before being transmitted to fleet commanders. But the intensity of the developing battle had strained Allied communication networks beyond their normal capacity. Messages were being processed with minimal verification. Coordinate calculations were being transmitted with abbreviated checking procedures, and the normal safeguards against individual error were being bypassed in the interest of speed and responsiveness. Morrison's coordinate error slipped through this degraded verification system and became part of the intelligence picture that both Allied and Japanese commanders used for tactical planning. The mistake was small enough to seem plausible, consistent enough with other intelligence reports to avoid triggering additional scrutiny, and transmitted with enough apparent authority to be accepted without question by the officers who received it. The Japanese interception of Morrison's false coordinates created a complex feedback loop of deception and self-deception. Admiral Ozawa believed that Allied forces thought his fleet was 47 miles northwest of its actual position. He didn't know that this belief was based on a British navigation error rather than deliberate Allied misinformation. He planned his movements to exploit what he thought was an Allied intelligence failure, never realizing that he was actually responding to an Allied intelligence mistake. The distinction between failure and mistake might seem academic, but it had profound tactical implications. If Allied intelligence had failed to track Japanese movements accurately, Ozawa could assume that his actual position remained secret and plan accordingly. But if Allied intelligence had made a simple calculation error, the mistake could be corrected at any time, potentially exposing Japanese movements to accurate Allied tracking. Ozawa chose to interpret Morrison's error as intelligence failure rather than calculation mistake, and planned his fleet movements to maintain the deception that he believed was protecting his approach to the target area. This decision led him to maintain a course that would keep his ships in the position indicated by Morrison's false coordinates, rather than maneuvering freely toward his intended target. The course that Ozawa chose to maintain brought his fleet into direct contact with a weather system that Pacific meteorologists had failed to predict accurately. Weather forecasting in the Pacific Theater was complicated by the vast distances between observation stations, the limited number of weather reconnaissance flights, and the rapid development of storm systems over warm ocean waters. The typhoon that intercepted Ozawa's fleet had formed quickly in the area southwest of Guam, gaining strength as it moved northward through water temperatures that exceeded 85 degrees Fahrenheit. The storm's rapid development had caught both Allied and Japanese meteorologists by surprise, and its projected path had not been accurately calculated by either side's weather services. Under normal circumstances, Ozawa's fleet would have detected the approaching storm in time to maneuver around it, or take protective measures to minimize damage. Japanese ships were equipped with barometric instruments, wind gauges, and other weather monitoring equipment that could provide early warning of dangerous atmospheric conditions. But Ozawa's decision to maintain his position based on Morrison's false coordinates placed his fleet directly in the storm's path at the worst possible time. Instead of detecting the typhoon early enough to avoid it, the Japanese ships encountered it during the night hours when visibility was limited and maneuvering was most difficult. The storm struck the Japanese fleet with winds exceeding 100 knots, waves higher than 40 feet, and rain so intense that it overwhelmed ship drainage systems and flooded lower decks. The carefully planned formation that Ozawa had maintained for weeks scattered like leaves in a hurricane, with individual ships struggling to survive rather than coordinate with the larger fleet. Aircraft carriers, the most valuable and vulnerable units in Ozawa's force, suffered particularly severe damage. Flight decks designed for launching aircraft became seas of moving water that made any kind of aviation operations impossible. Aircraft that had been prepared for the decisive battle were damaged by salt water, torn loose from their restraints, or swept overboard by waves that broke completely over carrier decks. The typhoon that Morrison's error had guided them into accomplished what months of Allied attacks had failed to achieve. It neutralized Japanese naval aviation for the critical hours when Operation Eigo was supposed to begin. Do you think Admiral Ozawa ever suspected that his fleet's encounter with the typhoon was the result of a British navigation error rather than natural bad luck? Do you think he understood that his decision to maintain position based on false Allied coordinates had steered his ships directly into a storm that would cripple his offensive capability? The moral complexity of Morrison's mistake extends beyond its immediate tactical consequences. The navigation error that scattered the Japanese fleet also saved the lives of thousands of civilian refugees who were sailing through the area where Operation Eigo was supposed to take place. 8 refugee ships carrying civilians evacuated from Japanese-occupied territories were traveling along shipping routes that intersected with Ozawa's intended path to the battle area. These vessels, loaded with families fleeing the advancing Allied forces, would have been directly in the path of the Japanese fleet if Operation Eigo had proceeded as originally planned. Naval warfare in the Pacific had become increasingly indiscriminate as the conflict intensified. Civilian vessels were legitimate targets if they could be considered to be supporting enemy military operations, and the distinction between combatant and non-combatant shipping had become blurred by the realities of total war. The refugee ships sailing through the Philippine Sea that night carried no military cargo, posed no threat to Japanese operations, and were attempting to transport civilians to safety rather than supporting Allied military activities. But they were sailing in a war zone, flying Allied flags, and following routes that could be considered strategically significant. If Ozawa's fleet had encountered these refugee ships during the approach to their intended battle area, the Japanese commanders would have faced a choice between humanitarian concerns and military necessity. International law required protection of civilian vessels, but wartime conditions often made such protection impossible or dangerous for military forces. Morrison's navigation error eliminated this moral dilemma by steering the Japanese fleet away from the refugee ships at the critical moment when Operation Eigo was supposed to begin. The typhoon that scattered Ozawa's formation also provided cover for the civilian vessels, hiding them from Japanese reconnaissance aircraft and allowing them to continue their journey to safety. The refugees aboard those 8 ships never knew how close they had come to becoming casualties of a naval battle they had nothing to do with. They experienced the same storm that devastated the Japanese fleet, but as passengers seeking shelter rather than as combatants seeking victory. For them, the typhoon was an ordeal to be endured rather than a tactical disaster that changed the course of history. Morrison's calculation error had created a chain of consequences that connected mathematical mistakes to meteorological chaos, to humanitarian salvation in ways that no planning process could have anticipated. A decimal point in the wrong position had guided the most powerful naval force in the Pacific into a storm that saved thousands of civilian lives. But the story doesn't end with scattered fleets and rescued refugees. The consequences of Morrison's mistake rippled through the larger strategic situation in ways that affected the entire course of the Pacific War. The delay caused by the typhoon gave American forces time to complete their preparations for the battle that would become known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Admiral Spruance's carriers were able to position themselves advantageously, coordinate their fighter defenses, and prepare for the Japanese attack under conditions that favored Allied forces rather than Japanese ones. When Ozawa's scattered fleet finally regrouped and launched their delayed attack, they faced American forces that were ready for them rather than surprised by them. The result was the most decisive Allied victory in Pacific naval aviation, with Japanese losses so severe that their carrier-based air power never recovered for the remainder of the war. Morrison's navigation error had contributed to a tactical outcome that shortened the war, reduced casualties on both sides, and accelerated the Allied advance toward the Japanese mainland. The mistake that had seemed like a minor calculation error had become a factor in strategic victory. But Morrison still didn't know about any of this. His corrected coordinates had been transmitted and acknowledged. His error had been noted in the appropriate logs, and he had continued his duties as a navigation specialist aboard HMS Victorias. The broader consequences of his mistake remained invisible to him, hidden in the complex interactions between individual actions and historical outcomes. The Japanese perspective on the typhoon encounter was complicated by their incomplete understanding of what had caused their fleet to be in the storm's path at such a critical moment. Admiral Ozawa's staff conducted extensive reviews of their navigation procedures, weather forecasting methods, and intelligence analysis techniques, searching for explanations for what appeared to be an unprecedented combination of bad luck and poor planning. Some Japanese analysts concluded that Allied intelligence had been more sophisticated than previously believed, capable of predicting Japanese movements accurately enough to manipulate them into disadvantageous positions. Others blamed Japanese meteorological services for failing to predict the typhoon's development and path accurately. None of the Japanese reviews identified the true cause of their fleet's encounter with the storm, a British navigation error that had created false intelligence, which had been intercepted and used as the basis for tactical decisions that placed Japanese ships in the worst possible position at the worst possible time. The inability to identify the real cause of their tactical disaster contributed to Japanese strategic confusion during the remainder of the war. If Allied intelligence was sophisticated enough to manipulate Japanese fleet movements, then conventional operational planning might be futile. If Japanese weather forecasting was inadequate for Pacific operations, then all naval operations became subject to unacceptable environmental risks. This confusion contributed to the increasingly defensive and reactive Japanese strategy that characterized their naval operations for the remainder of the war. Instead of attempting large-scale offensive operations like Operation Eigo, Japanese commanders focused on preserving their remaining naval assets for homeland defense, effectively ceding the initiative to Allied forces. Morrison's calculation error had contributed to a shift in Japanese strategic thinking that went far beyond its immediate tactical consequences. The mistake that had lasted for 6 hours had created doubts that would influence Japanese decision-making for the remainder of the war. The Allied perspective on the Philippine Sea battle emphasized the tactical success of American fighter pilots and the effective coordination of carrier operations under Admiral Spruance's command. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot entered American military mythology as an example of superior training, better equipment, and effective leadership overcoming Japanese numerical advantages. The role of the typhoon in scattering the Japanese fleet before the battle began was noted in official reports, but minimized in popular accounts of the engagement. Weather was considered a natural factor rather than a strategic element, something that affected both sides equally rather than favoring Allied operations specifically. The connection between Morrison's navigation error and the storm's impact on Japanese operations remained hidden in classified communications files that would not be declassified for decades. Even when the files became available to historians, the significance of the coordinate mistake was difficult to trace through the complex chain of cause and effect that connected British calculations to Japanese movements to meteorological encounters. Morrison himself learned about his mistake's broader consequences only gradually, through post-war historical research that pieced together the events of June 19, 1944. A letter from an American naval historian in 1967 was the first indication Morrison received that his calculation error had influenced events beyond routine navigation corrections. The historian, Commander Robert Heinlein, no relation to the science fiction author, had been researching Allied intelligence operations in the Pacific Theater when he discovered Morrison's coordinate correction in British naval archives. Cross-referencing this information with Japanese operational records that had become available after the war, Heinlein had identified the connection between the navigation error and the typhoon encounter. "Your calculation mistake," Heinlein wrote to Morrison, "may have been the most fortunate error in the history of naval warfare. By guiding the Japanese fleet into that storm, you gave American forces the time they needed to prepare for the decisive battle that followed. You also saved the lives of thousands of civilian refugees who would have been in the path of the Japanese attack." Morrison read Heinlein's letter with emotions that were difficult to categorize: pride in having contributed to Allied victory, embarrassment at having made a calculation error, confusion about the role of chance and mistake in historical events, and wonder at the way individual actions could have consequences that extended far beyond their apparent significance. He kept Heinlein's letter for the rest of his life, but he never framed it or displayed it prominently. The letter represented something that was both achievement and accident, both success and failure, both individual action and historical force. It was evidence of something too complex to celebrate simply and too important to dismiss entirely. Morrison's story became part of the growing literature about the role of chance, error, and unintended consequences in historical events. Military historians began to recognize that wars were decided not just by planning, leadership, and resources, but also by the accumulation of small mistakes, lucky breaks, and random events that could not be predicted or controlled by commanders on either side. The typhoon that scattered Admiral Ozawa's fleet entered this historical literature as an example of how natural forces could interact with human error to produce outcomes that changed the course of major events. Morrison's navigation mistake became a case study in how individual technical errors could have strategic consequences that extended far beyond their immediate scope. But perhaps the most important aspect of Morrison's story was its illustration of the humanitarian dimension of military error. The mistake that had scattered a Japanese fleet had also saved thousands of civilian lives. The calculation error that had contributed to Allied victory had also prevented a humanitarian disaster that would have added to the already enormous civilian casualties of the Pacific War. The 8 refugee ships that continued safely to their destinations carried families who would rebuild their lives in Allied-controlled territories, children who would grow up in the post-war world, and elderly people who would live to see peace return to the Pacific. Their survival was connected to Morrison's decimal point error in ways that none of them would ever know, but which made their continued existence part of the broader historical consequences of that night in the communications room of HMS Victorious. The refugees included a family named Tanaka, who had fled the Japanese occupation of the Philippines and were sailing toward Australia when Morrison's mistake guided the Japanese fleet away from their path. Their 12-year-old daughter, Keiko, would grow up to become a doctor, treating both Allied and Japanese veterans of the Pacific War in a hospital in Sydney. Keiko never knew that her life had been saved by a British navigation error, but she spent her career treating the after-effects of the war that had nearly killed her family. She specialized in trauma surgery, helping men who had been wounded in the same battles that had scattered and saved the refugee ship that carried her to safety. The Yamamoto family, evacuating from Japanese-occupied Singapore, included an infant son who would grow up to become an engineer, designing the navigation systems that would make Morrison's kind of calculation error virtually impossible in modern naval operations. His work would contribute to GPS technology, satellite navigation, and computer-assisted course plotting that would eliminate human error from maritime navigation. The Chen family, fleeing the Japanese occupation of Hong Kong, carried with them the plans for a small electronics factory that they would rebuild in Allied territory. Their post-war manufacturing business would produce components for the radar systems that made Morrison's work possible, creating the technological infrastructure that supported the kind of precise navigation that Morrison had been attempting when he made his crucial mistake. These individual stories, multiplied across 8 refugee ships and thousands of passengers, represented the human dimension of Morrison's error. The mistake that had changed naval history had also preserved individual lives that would contribute to the post-war world in ways that could not be calculated or predicted. Morrison himself returned to civilian life after the war, working as a surveyor in the reconstruction of British cities that had been damaged by German bombing. His work required the same kind of precise calculation that had characterized his naval service, but with consequences that were constructive rather than destructive. He never made another significant calculation error in his professional career, but he also never forgot that his most important contribution to the war effort had been a mistake. The decimal point that he had placed incorrectly had guided a Japanese fleet into a storm that changed the course of history and saved thousands of lives. In the end, Morrison's story became a reminder that precision and accuracy, while important, were not always the most important qualities in human endeavor. Sometimes, being wrong in the right way could be more valuable than being right in the wrong way. Sometimes, the mistake that should cause disaster instead prevented catastrophe. The navigation chart that Morrison had marked incorrectly was preserved in British Naval Archives, annotated with corrections and explanations that documented both the error and its consequences. The chart became part of the historical record not because it was accurate, but because it was wrong in a way that mattered. Morrison's decimal point error had demonstrated that individual actions, even mistaken ones, could have consequences that extended far beyond their immediate scope. A calculation mistake in a communications room could guide fleets into storms, save civilian lives, and contribute to strategic outcomes that shaped the post-war world. The storm that scattered Admiral Ozawa's fleet had been a natural phenomenon, but Morrison's error had transformed it into a historical factor that influenced the outcome of the Pacific War. The typhoon would have occurred regardless of human actions, but its intersection with Japanese naval operations had been determined by a British navigation mistake that guided ships into weather that no one had predicted. If stories like this make you think about the hidden connections between individual errors and historical outcomes, about the way natural forces can be channeled by human mistakes, about the navigation charts we all follow, and the decimal points we all sometimes misplace, then perhaps you understand why some errors are worth preserving, why some storms are worth remembering, and why the most important navigation sometimes happens when we admit we don't know exactly where we are.